Hello, my name is Faye Moore. I'm a longtime resident of Port Hope. I was raised there and I raised my family there. I was born in 1950. I have 3 children. I have been a volunteer with the Port Hope Community Health Concerns Committee since it was formed in 1994. I'm currently presenting today as an individual. We have had many experiences in dealing with the nuclear industries and the radioactive waste in Port Hope, Ontario, Canada. I'm happy to share some of these experiences with you today, and thank you very much for inviting me for the opportunity to speak to some of what we have experienced. This is a picture of a beach house, and in the background you will see Eldorado Nuclear Limited. This is filmed around 1955 and was a tourism postcard. In Port Hope, there are 3 federally licensed nuclear facilities and a nuclear project. So they consist of a chemical uranium conversion facility, which was the former Eldorado, and it's located on Lake Ontario at the mouth of the Ganaraska River, producing uranium dioxide and uranium hexafluoride. Chemical fuel manufacturing facility is located on a busy Highway 2, part of the Trans-Canada Highway, and is licensed to process and store natural, depleted, and enriched uranium compounds and produces fuel bundles. There's a storage area, and there will be pictures of each of these, that contains chemical cylinders, and over the years, some have contained material that emitted radiation. And it's situated in a neighborhood with open air storage beside sidewalk and public parking. Each of these facilities is licensed by the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, a federal regulator. The 4th project is a $2.6 billion federal remediation of 1.8 million cubic meters of radioactive wastes. This is being conducted under the umbrella of the federal government, utilizing Atomic Energy of Canada Limited and Canadian Nuclear Laboratories, which struck the Port Hope Area Initiative. So this is a cleanup of radioactive waste in Port Hope and a neighboring community, Port Granby. The estimate was 1.8 million cubic meters of historic Eldorado low-level radioactive wastes were throughout both communities, and the remediation is based on a legal agreement signed with 3 municipalities in 2001. This is to give you an idea of the location on Lake Ontario, one of the lakes in the Great Lakes system, on the border with the United States. This is an idea where the chemical conversion facility is located, looking back to the surrounding neighborhood. This is the buffer zone. In actual fact, there is no empty space between Chemical Corporation and the conversion facility and the neighborhoods around it. This is another view, and this is the Ganaraska River flowing into Lake Ontario, a very popular recreation area. The chemical conversion facility is located on a floodplain of the Ganaraska River and Lake Ontario, and this is a photograph taken from 2019 of that area. This is the chemical fuel manufacturing facility, which takes the uranium and prepares the fuel bundles, and that's located on a busy Highway 2 in a neighborhood of homes and businesses. This is the licensed chemical storage area in a neighborhood with cylinders that emit radiation when they still have contents. This is an aerial view of the new long-term storage facility, which is located beside Lake Ontario. There is no buffer zone from new homes that are being built around it and soccer fields that are adjacent. This is from an environmental assessment for Cameco that shows the aerial deposition going out from the conversion facility over the town of Port Hope. And the next couple of slides provide a background of how the nuclear industries came to be in Port Hope. And it started in 1930 with Gilbert Labine discovering pitchblende ore while prospecting for gold in the Northwest Territories. After it was analyzed in Ottawa, it was discovered to contain 60% uranium, which was very rich. So over the years, Marcel Pochon, who was a colleague of Madame Curie in France, came to Port Hope and managed the operations and called it El Dorado gold mines. One of the problems was that emerged right away is that when they were refining for radium, they found it took 25 tons of concentrate to produce 1 gram of radium and 7 tons of chemicals to process 1 ton of ore, which created a significant volume of wastes. So the background of the nuclear industry in Port Hope continued to, in 1944, the federal government took over the private company and made it a federal crown corporation, subsequently regulated by the Atomic Energy Control Board. El Dorado adapted its processes in 1942 from radium to uranium and expanded its facilities to meet contracts with the US Army. Its name changed at that point. In the 40s and 50s, El Dorado played a central role in establishing a Canadian uranium industry, and it required significant financial support from the federal government when the US contracts ended. And the material from Port Hope was unfortunately used for the Manhattan Project. And this is a brief overview of the feed and the process of the nuclear industry in Port Hope and how Cameco became a crown corporation, or El Dorado became a crown corporation, and then it was purchased by a private consortium in 1988. And in 2006, Cameco purchased 100% interest in Zircotech Precision Industries. And so both operations in Port Hope are under the Cameco umbrella. So how did radioactive contamination of Port Hope happen? From the 1930s to the 70s, properties in and around Port Hope became contaminated due to careless management and disposal of radioactive wastes. From spillage during transportation, unrecorded, unmonitored, or unauthorized diversion of contaminated fills and materials, wind, water, erosion, and spread from residue storage areas. They were also offered to the public free of charge. So the discovery over the years, which is continuing today, and this is September of 2024, more and more locations are being discovered, and the extent of the contamination at locations is still being discovered. In addition to the problems with the dumping and the use of the properties in and around Port Hope, both private and public, there were also daily industrial particulate emissions from both plants that impact the air, water, soil, vegetation. The discovery of radioactive waste contamination in Port Hope was first made by Dr. Douglas Andrews. He was a nuclear engineer at the University of Toronto, and he had been sent to Port Hope by the RCMP to find out if there was so much uranium laying around the town that it could be used for illegal purposes. He made his report back, and he identified that there was a significant problem of contamination in the community, and with the location of waste being put on hills where there was runoff down through the town and into the river. In 1975, the first information really became public about the problems and the high levels of radon gas in some buildings, including a primary school. In 1976, there was the first public meeting with federal provincial officials, including Dr. Andrews, and he was severely criticized by officials, including our municipal council, for his efforts. And from that time forward, concerned local residents began advocacy for full remediation and restoration, which has continued for 48 years to today in 2024. I was present at that meeting in February 1976. This is a clipping from that meeting where Dr. Andrews spoke to the people and said that what was happening was unacceptable. One of the first areas to be remediated in the late 70s was the beach. And this beach canteen was dismantled and taken to a radioactive dump site in the community of Chalk River, which was the location of a lot of the nuclear research for the federal government. The neighborhood around the beach house was dismantled because it was contaminated, and the homes were taken to Chalk River as well, and some of the beach. But the area was still not fully remediated, and there is remediation ongoing now of the beach area. So what was the federal government to do? It was hearing now that there was a growing problem. There were calls for cleanup. So back in 1976, they established a task force on radioactivity to continue to survey the town, and 100,000 tons of soil was transported. But then it had to stop because they had nowhere to take it. They did not fence it off. It was not contained. Children played in it, and many, many locations were not identified. It was so desperate that a group of 129 Port Hope residents applied for intervention to the United Nations Human Rights Committee in April 1980. However, the decision issued in 1982 from the UN was to find the citizen petition inadmissible. The Canadian government had said, "You don't have jurisdiction because the people of Port Hope have not sued us yet, and all domestic remedies have not been exhausted." In dealing with the radioactive contamination of Port Hope, an office was formed in 1982 called the Low-Level Radioactive Waste Management Office. At first, in 1986, the federal government established a siting task force, which was to find a location to take the radioactive waste out of Port Hope and locate it somewhere else. This was unsuccessful, and in the late 1990s, the three affected municipalities, Port Hope, Hope Township, and Clarington, and now Hope Township and Port Hope, are amalgamated, but at the time they were separate. They came up with a local solution. They basically were backed into a corner to do so, being told if they did not agree to keep the waste, the federal government would probably not look at them again for another 50 years in terms of finding a solution. So the municipalities got together and agreed and came to a legal agreement with the federal government. And there was a federal financial commitment that has increased over the years, and as of 2022, reached $2.6 billion in financial commitment to remediate the Port Granby area, which contains El Dorado waste, and the Port Hope area into two new temporary storage facilities. In 2001, there were some aerial surveys done of Port Hope, and the next few slides show what they showed. The uranium parts per million from the gamma aerial survey, thorium parts per million registered, the absorbed dose rate gamma survey 2001. So there was significant contamination across the town, and it was documented in 2001 and not shared, to my knowledge, until I received this documentation under access to information requests. But it was the beginning of them understanding how widespread the problem was. The work of our health committee was intended to try and focus on the health of the people, which had not been done. And as a result, there were several statistical studies that were paid for by the federal government, and they indicated that Port Hope had elevated rates of diseases. And this is health outcome data. And it's from 2000 and 2002, and they were peer-reviewed by Dr. Eric Mintz, an epidemiologist, but they were prepared by Health Canada, federal department, and issued by the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. And you can see, I won't go through all of these, but there were significantly elevated rates of diseases across the board: circulatory, cancers, neurological, hereditary, and those are data from 3 studies. Again, the Great Lakes Health Effects Program Health Study on the population around Port Hope Harbor, issued in 1998, showed significantly higher than Ontario for the following list. At our request, independent epidemiologist Dr. Eric Mintz performed independent peer review, and he issued these statements, including the patterns of several cancer rates show cause for concern in that the patterns are consistent with environmental contamination. There were 100 more female deaths than expected in the 1986 to 97 period due to circulatory disease, a surprise finding that required further scrutiny. Findings suggest children experienced high cancer rates, particularly before 1986. Along with the brain cancer, colon cancer, and some of the rare cancer results, the available evidence points to there being problems in Port Hope. This is a friend and colleague, a member of the Port Hope Community Health Concerns Committee board. He's a former worker at the fuel manufacturing facility when it was under Zircotec ownership from 1992 to 1904. He worked there for about a year and a half. He lost his final workman's compensation appeal in 2024, despite documented uranium poisoning in the workplace. Dan has had a double lung transplant. We look to the south. The U.S. Department of Justice recognizes harm from radiation and uranium exposure in law, and we argue that Canada needs to do the same. And you can see a list of cancers and diseases for which compensation is issued, both under the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act and the Energy Employees Occupational Illness Compensation Act. And close to $20 billion has been paid out to eligible claimants. So the Port Hope Beach was contaminated, the West Beach. As youngsters, teenagers, we had cleaned it up, we painted it. Before we had dances, we picked up dead fish along the shore, not sure why they were dead, bagged them to make it a little more attractive for the get-togethers. And this was the building that was dismantled, as I mentioned, and taken to the Chalk River dump. In 2023, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission again dismissed the Port Hope health data. It refuses monitoring. There is no health monitoring that is connected to the operation of the industries or to the cleanup that is ongoing. And while they acknowledge the concerns raised by the intervener, which was myself as an individual, as well as chair of the committee, they concluded that the Commission is satisfied that the health of the persons in Port Hope is protected. And this is on the Canada.ca website. Is background radiation in Port Hope elevated? So they asked the wrong question and they got the wrong answer. But it is deceptive. Of course it's elevated. This was an area, this is a photograph from some years ago. This was the only pool in Port Hope and a tennis court, and there's a children's pool there. That area, all of it is under remediation right now for radioactive and industrial waste. This was an outdoor skating rink on another street, a tennis court, and it has undergone remediation and requires more. This was an elementary school that I and thousands of other children attended, and it was also contaminated. And as far as I know at this point, it still is and has not been fully remediated, but it closed as a school in 2007 and is currently in apartments. Housing on the right-hand side is relatively new in the last 10 years or so, 10 to 15 years after the closure, and that used to be school playground. Some radioactive waste was removed from the school property, and a report of several years ago, probably around 2022, indicated that another 650 cubic meters of radioactive waste still needed to be removed from the Dr. Power School property. This is a report on a house that I grew up in, where my mother requested them to come and test the house, and they discovered El Dorado pipes in the basement. There were four pipes and one supporting wooden beam to which my children's blackboard was attached, where I played by the hour with my sister and friends. This is a house that I lived in with my husband and children, and we purchased that in 1991 and found that it had radioactive waste on the front yard, which was not disclosed to us. And the reason that was given is that, well, it's actually municipal frontage and belongs to the municipality. And so the policy of the Canadian Nuclear Laboratories and the Portaberry Initiative was not to disclose to people when their frontage had radioactive waste on it. So we have been challenging that policy. And this is the house being remediated. This occurred about 2 months after we sold the house. Up until that point, they had refused to confirm to me that there was radioactive waste on the property. This is a very common sight around Port Hope, trucks carrying radioactive waste to the temporary storage facility. I took this picture about a week ago of remediation underway at a seniors recreation center. This is a playground just down the street from Dr. Power School, undergoing remediation right now. This is where, for many, many generations of children, it was the official school playground where we spent recesses, and it's been a neighborhood playground since the school closed. These are houses backing on that playground, also being remediated. This is the temporary storage area, which is just adjacent to the town's sports complex, and it's at the location of the former Port Hope landfill site, where the waste was commingled. And this was one of the locations that Dr. Andrews had such concern about, because this is on a hill, and there was considerable runoff going down the hill, past homes and also into the Ganaraska River. This was the site of a fire museum where many volunteers worked for years. The fire museum was dismantled and the soil excavated due to radioactive material. These are houses up on the left, and this is remediation of an occupied residential area in 2022. This is an area just below a hill where waste was just dumped down the ravine, or at the end, this is a dead-end street. And my sister lived in an adjacent house with her children. And you can see from the legend that there is radioactive waste that was located there. And this information I have received through access to information requests. So this is the lower part of the city, and at the very, very bottom, you'll see a little blue dot by the water, and that is the slide set that was on the first slide that I showed. It's a little jungle gym for children. So all of this area, and these are borehole results that were showing the need for remediation. The fire museum was just located up the left-hand side. And this is further up beside the Ganaraska River. And this is how that area is used for boat races in the spring, occupied by hundreds and hundreds of people along that contaminated park and roadway for generations, unknowingly. This is a view of the fire museum from the street above it, looking down, and then you see the chemical conversion facility in the background. So we had a number of concerns as a committee and as individuals. And in March 2021, we were objecting to the Canadian Nuclear Laboratories pressuring Port Hope to amend the legal agreement to weaken the cleanup criteria for uranium and arsenic. And they have since changed this and are leaving the uranium and the arsenic. They have changed, rather than wanting a change to 100 parts per million, they're looking at 56 parts per million. They wanted to transfer contaminated sludge from Port Granby to Port Hope. And a very significant concern is allowing property owners to choose to remediate their property or not. And during this cleanup, when significant money is being allocated, we're saying this is the time. It should be mandatory. We've all been through COVID lockdowns. We've all been aware for many years of public health rules and requirements. To allow property owners in Port Hope to opt out of a cleanup and then potentially sell their house a year down the road to somebody else to be stuck with a problem again is completely ridiculous and is not in keeping with the commitments made to the community. And we see this as these measures as trying to speed it along, save money on the part of the federal government, and get rid of this problem. And we're saying at the time that we needed a comprehensive audit and renewed budget for full mandatory Port Hope remediation. The ongoing transfer of contaminated property from one generation to the next has to be stopped at this point now while we can. We had remediation concerns that there was failure to properly investigate, remediate, and disclose the truth to the public about the contamination, for example, at Dr. Power School, municipal roads and frontages, parks, the beach, private properties. There's been a lack of disclosure to property owners. There's been insufficient testing of the waste, and that all the time this is going on, there is no health monitoring of the residents. The size of the temporary facility is too small for the true volume of wastes. We made key recommendations to the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission in November of 2022. And I will come back to those in a few minutes. The recommendations that we made were for a comprehensive audit of the federal remediation operations, independent health monitoring and reporting, determine future needs to fully restore the community as promised, public disclosure of all radioactive waste locations, a national public inquiry into past and future management of radioactive waste in Canada, and to provide compensation for the forgotten people of Port Hope and other communities, Indigenous communities, that have suffered for years with exposure to radioactive material, carelessly maintained and to also consider the best way to contain radioactive waste in the future. Thank you.